Our next speaker this evening is Kathy Kesselman. Kathy worked as a GP before life events led her to face her past trauma. She has written a memoir chronicling that journey of recovery from child sexual abuse and is driven by the passion to empower others to heal from complex trauma. Kathy is the president of the Blue Knot Foundation, the deputy chair of the National Centre for Action on Child Sexual Abuse, and has been a key driver of the trauma-informed care practice in Australia. Kathy was awarded an AM for significant service to community health as a supporter and advocate for survivors of child abuse. Please welcome Kathy.
So thank you for inviting me here tonight to speak alongside a really incredible group of people. I'm delighted to share with you a few insights from my journey, not because my journey is more important than anyone else's, more because it provides a window into the real possibility of healing from the mental turmoil wrought by a childhood which no child should ever be subjected to. That said, I'm not here to say that I'm healed, all done and cured, because I don't believe that's how it works. I believe that we're all continually learning and evolving regardless of our hurdles and our legacy. So why am I speaking? Well, I was invited. But seriously, I see it as a vital opportunity to stand up and be counted. Brave talks are critical conversations to have because silence and stigma prevent us from making honest connections. Mental well-being is about us all, as individuals, in families and a community. It's time for us to stop pretending that there is a them and us, a group that's fine and dandy, and another which is not. Experiencing mental distress and being vulnerable is part of the human condition. The reality is that we all experience stuff along life's journey. And let's be honest, there's plenty of stuff to go around. And stuff affects us all. It affects us in different ways, depending on who we are, the support we have, how we were nurtured or not, our culture, our background, and so forth. A whole range of factors determine how we cope. Traumatic stuff can completely overwhelm our capacity to cope and causes considerable mental distress at the time and subsequently, and that's what's happened to me. And so, when my past trauma bubbled back up when I was in my mid-40s, my vulnerability was there for the whole world to see, alongside the shame, confusion, and angst that went with it. The journey back is not one I would have chosen, but it's brought me to a much more grounded place, which previously was right outside of my reach. So before I go there, rest assured that I'm not sharing any particular details of what happened to me, as I don't believe graphic descriptions are helpful, but rather more how it affected me, how I coped, and my path through. That said, sharing reflections about trauma and mental distress are confronting. So please look after yourselves, and I won't be offended if you need to leave at any time. So, I grew up in Queensland in a small, very isolated family with a mother who experienced unimaginable and unspeakable trauma during the Holocaust, and a father, a highly sensitive Renaissance man, born to an everyday Australian family in which violence and coercion were endemic and systematised. I and my older brother were swallowed up within a secretive and brutal cycle of sexual and emotional abuse, perpetuated with the family as well as within religious settings. And so my childhood was one of danger and fear, in which I was continually anticipating the next assault and struggled to feel and be safe. It was also one of betrayal by the very people who should have provided nurture and comfort, but who, because of their own traumatic experiences, were simply incapable of being there. I had no one to turn to who could help me make sense of what was happening to me. And so how did I cope? Well, I believe the mind is simply incredible, and the 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14-year-old me created its own vibrant, imaginative world and an internal community of connection and support which my external world lacked. I compartmentalised my trauma, subconsciously burying it, so the sheer mass of experience did not overwhelm my capacity to function. And somehow, albeit somewhat robotically, just got on with it. I also became an amazingly solid tennis player, rhythmically, repeatedly hitting a tennis ball against the wall, calming my heightened nervous system, without understanding why and what I was doing. I was the very good little girl, terrified of my own shadow, scared to speak, even in private, the perfect student, with school providing some relief to the madness at home. I caused no trouble, and so no one seemed to notice anything untoward. I studied medicine, married, had 4 amazing children, and my son's here tonight, and he's incredibly special, and my trauma remained locked away. And then my niece, with whom I was very close, died suddenly in a car accident. And her death was reminiscent of the sudden loss of my father I'd experienced when I was 14. And that was the trigger which started my inner world to unravel. And unravel I certainly did. One might have assumed that being medically trained, I would have understood what panic attacks were. But when they struck, I thought I was going to die. And when I experienced flashbacks, they were just so real that I felt like I was losing my mind. I had no idea that they were intense fragments of traumatic memories from my past returning. They would hit without warning, and I would be thrown right back into the moment in full flight, but without a context. And they became my world all over again, just like the trauma had been during my childhood. As I was taken over by my memories and my anxieties subsumed me, I slipped into a deep depression and withdrew back into a very familiar childhood space of isolation. And for a couple of years, I became virtually bedbound, mustering all my energy to get the kids off to school, to return under the covers for as long as I could. I was barely able to care for myself, let alone my family. Naturally, I was forced to give up work as a GP, at the same time foregoing my sense of self, which had been defined by being a doctor, as I simply couldn't function. Fortunately, a few months into my turmoil, I had sufficient insight to start to see a clinical psychologist, and for a time a psychiatrist as well. That was quite the move for someone who was just so fiercely independent and distrusting as I was. And even though my therapist was there for me as unconditionally as boundaries permit, it took me several years to trust her and to feel safe and know that she could keep me in mind, as this was not an experience I had ever had growing up. And so began a very long and torturous journey from seemingly having it all and doing it all with apparent ease to being virtually non-functional, and then in turn, gradually, with my therapist walking alongside me, clawing my way back to the world. To the external eye, and in psychiatric terms, I was mentally ill because I met the diagnoses for multiple disorders all at the same time. However, the reality was that I was living a roller coaster of trauma. Body memories, a dysregulated nervous system, different trauma reactions, and their mental health accompaniments. I was an absolute mess, and for several years, my life in the present receded as chunks of the past trauma became my daily reality. It was a time of survival in which my past was so consuming that I lost hope that life could ever improve. And as the fragments of trauma returned, I started to build a picture of what had happened to me and identified in retrospect that I had little to no memory for 10 years of my childhood. If someone asked me about my childhood prior to my breakdown, I would say, I had a happy childhood, my mother told me so. And if they asked for more detail, I'd jump down their throat as I had no information to give, good or bad. My almost complete amnesia, we now know, can be a sign of significant trauma. And so over many painful and distressing years, I gathered together a narrative for my life. And to me, that's the power of lived and living experience stories. Because if we don't know where we've come from and what's happened to us, how can we know who we are? Like with all memory, always remembered or not. I know some details of my narrative might not be precise. However, overall, to me, that it makes incredible sense and explains so much about me and the ways I functioned, often in retrospect, devoid of emotion and very, very defended. And so, with exploration, processing and support, I started to see some glimmers of light. And over time, my mental distress lessened and my diagnoses simply faded away. Not to say this journey has been easy. For me, my husband, my children, but given my past, it was one that I had to have. It's brought me, and hopefully us, to a vastly different place. One of relative peace, calm, and much deeper connection. And so what messages do I want to leave with you? Simply to say that my journey has taught me many lessons about compassion, acceptance, and understanding around mental distress. Lessons which I feel are universal. As a GP, I'm trained biomedically and believe science and medicine have an enormous part to play, but so too does an understanding of what's happened to people along life's journey. I was one of the lucky ones. I had the resources and capacity to access the therapeutic support I needed and had a family of support and some amazing friends around me. This was my journey, but by far not the only possible process. There's no one path to healing. We are all unique, just as our experiences are unique. Each of us must find what works for us, and it's often a whole range of things at different times in our lives. I would say, however, that as human beings, we're social creatures, which means that it's incredibly hard to heal in isolation. The trauma I experienced was caused by human beings. I needed to overcome the withering shame and self-blame of abuse and learn how to trust people and to feel safe. And I needed to find a sense of myself as me and for me and in my relationships with others and the world. It's hard to see who is there at times, and it can be hard to reach out and ask for help too. In fact, it's often the hardest when we need help the most. That's why it's good to have these sorts of conversations, to break down the stigma of mental distress and come together as a community. And so, finally, just to say that there is help even when you can't see it, and there is hope even when it doesn't feel like it, and life can be rich and full and simply wondrous. Thank you.